So tonight I'd like to speak about mindfulness, introducing mindfulness, sati in Pali. Mindfulness is one of the key terms that you find in the Buddha's teaching. It's a key term in talking about meditation practice. And mindfulness has also become very fashionable, very popular outside of Buddhism. I don't know what the situation is in Malaysia, but in Australia, mindfulness has become very popular among the therapeutic community. Over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of psychological studies done on mindfulness and mindfulness interventions. It's used by psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists. There's a whole number of clinical conditions that these days are being treated through the use of mindfulness. So it's become scientific, it's become part of the ordinary everyday culture. Although at the same time there's a great deal of confusion about what exactly it is. Usually in the therapeutic community, mindfulness refers to essentially paying attention to one's experience. That's really what they mean by it. There's no real agreement among the different practitioners about what exactly it is. If we come back to the world of Buddhist meditation, even there's not much agreement about what exactly mindfulness is. There's lots of different opinions. Often people use the word mindfulness to mean the same thing as awareness. So if I say, please be aware of something, does that mean that I'm saying, please be mindful of something? Is mindfulness and awareness, are they the same? Or are they different? And if they're different, how are they different? What I might do, which I normally don't do in Dharma talks, is actually have a meditation experiment. A couple of brief ones, just to introduce this whole idea of mindfulness. What I'd like you to do, don't do anything special, don't change your posture, just as you are sitting. But as you are sitting, just hold your hands together. And feel your hands. That's the end of our meditation period. Could you feel your hands? Yeah? General agreement? Anybody who could not feel their hands? Okay. That's awareness. So you were aware of your hands. Did it take any special effort to feel your hands? It did. It was difficult? No? No? So there was no particular effort involved? Was it easy to feel your hands? Okay. In meditation practice, that is all the effort you ever need to make. That's all you need to do. It's really that simple. First of all, awareness. The fact is that we are already aware. We don't have to do anything to become aware. Every now and again, ask yourself the question, am I aware now? As you're sitting there, ask yourself the question, am I aware now? How many people came up with the answer, yes? If we ask ourselves the question, am I aware now? The answer is always yes. If I wasn't aware, I wouldn't even be asking the question. Basically, we are already aware. or it's the nature of the mind to be aware. It's the nature of the mind to know an object. Awareness is something already built in to the human being. And in fact, it's very, very difficult to not be aware. I'm sure they don't have places like this in Malaysia, but in Australia there's a whole series, a number of institutions that are devoted to the practice of no longer being aware. These institutions, they're in buildings, they're quite common. Often they're located at busy corners, and many people go there to engage in this practice, the spiritual practice of no longer being aware. In Australia we call these places pubs. And the practice involves consuming a great quantity of liquid. And the more of this liquid you consume, the less aware you become. If the practice is completely successful, you can completely lose awareness. Or at least make it very, very slight. So, for example, someone might go to the pub on a Friday night and they might wake up at about midday or the next day, and they might say to their friends, "That was a really good night, I can't remember anything." Now, they've spent a lot of money doing this, and they've also damaged their health. It takes an enormous amount of work and effort to stop being aware. It's really hard to not be aware, because awareness is absolutely built in to the human being. When we practice meditation, we're not trying to be aware. We don't have to try to be aware. We are already aware. So mindfulness is something else. Awareness in Pali, the language that the Buddha taught in, is vijnana. Mindfulness is sati. Our word mindfulness comes from a man called T.W. Rhys-Davids, who was a pioneer translator of Pali into English in the 19th century and early 20th century. He, as a young man, went out to the British colony of Ceylon in order to be a civil servant. And he was not successful. He got into trouble, I forget exactly what, but he got into some kind of trouble, and he was sent home. But fortunately, not until he had developed an interest in Pali. And Pali is the scriptural language of Theravada Buddhism, and it's the language in which we have the earliest teachings of the Buddha recorded. So Rhys-Davids studied Pali and started translating, and he was one of the founders of the Pali Text Society in Britain. So he and the people around him were pioneer translators from Pali into English, and he was the one who decided to translate the Pali word sati into the English word mindfulness. But what the word Pali actually means is memory. And it comes from the verb sarati, to remember. So why would the Buddha take a word which in his ordinary everyday language means memory, give it a technical spin and make it a technical term at the very centre of his approach to meditation? Why would he do that? This is something that we want to explore during this retreat. Sati, mindfulness, is memory, but what distinguishes it from ordinary memory is that it's memory of the present rather than the past. Mindfulness is remembering the present, or remembering what is present, or remembering to be present. But it's essentially remembering the present rather than the past. Although, in the way that the Buddha uses the term, there is still a link with remembering the past. In one discourse, Venerable Ananda is describing the mindful person, and he says, she recalls and recollects what was done and said long ago. So even for the Buddha, mindfulness can refer to memory of the past as well as the present. But certainly, if we want to investigate what do we mean by mindfulness, we need to look at it in terms of the present, which raises the question, what do we mean by the present? What is the present? Now, when we talk about the present, usually people add the word moment afterwards. I noticed this some years ago. Whenever I would listen to a Dharma talk where the person was talking about the present, they would always say the present moment. When I would read a Dharma book where they're talking about the present, they would always say the present moment. And I realised that when I, as a Dharma teacher, would talk about the present, I would always add the word moment afterwards. But is the present a moment? Well, what is a moment? A moment is a very brief period of time. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as a very brief portion or period of time, a point in time, an instant. So a moment is something that comes and goes in an instant. If I'm being mindful of the present moment, then I'm being mindful of something which is very quick. Oh, it's gone. But is that the way that I experience the present? And when we study the Buddha's teaching, we have to keep in mind that the Buddha is always coming from a first-person perspective. The Buddha is interested in the nature of experience. When he talks about the world, he's not talking about the world in the way that a scientist would talk about the world. He's talking about our experience of the world. And this is a significant difference. I'll give you an example. If I am educated, then I know that the Earth orbits around the Sun. The Earth is a globe, it turns on its axis, and it orbits around the Sun. So we say things like the sun rises and the sun sets, but actually it doesn't. What's really going on is that the Earth is orbiting around the Sun as it spins on its axis. Yet, if I look out at the east in the morning, the sun rises. If I look out at the west in the evening, it sets. That's what I experience. I do not experience the Earth spinning on its axis and orbiting around the Sun. That's not my experience. My experience is the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I can only think of one exception to this, and this was when I was doing a retreat here at SBS, a self-retreat, a couple of years ago, and I was in a kuti down below, in that direction, down below in the monks section. And this kuti, if you stand on the veranda at sunset, you can see the ocean. You can see the valley goes down to Taiping, and up there you can see the ocean. And when I was very mindful and standing on that veranda and looking, at first the sun was coming down to the horizon, but if I kept looking, I suddenly realised actually the horizon is going up to the sun. And I could feel it. It was quite strange. It was like I was falling backwards all the time. because the Earth was going like this, while the sun was just staying where it was. It was a very interesting experience. Now, what we're talking about is the difference between a third-person form of knowledge, which is science, and a first-person form of knowledge, which is what we actually experience. We actually experience sunrise and sunset. What the Buddha is interested in is not science. He's not creating a scientific theory. What he's doing is looking at the nature of human experience. What do I experience? How do I experience it? So in the group this afternoon, that's what we were talking about. What do you experience? How do you experience it? That's always what the Buddha is interested in. So if the Buddha is talking about the present, he's not talking about the present the way a scientist would. So he's not talking about clock time. He's talking about experienced time. Do I experience the present as a moment? Do you experience the present as a moment? For me, sometimes I do. Most commonly, I experience the present as a moment when I'm really busy and stressed. If I'm rushing from one thing to the next, then the present becomes a moment which passes very quickly. And what I'm doing is I'm rushing through it as fast as I can to get to the future when something satisfactory might happen, or something very unsatisfactory might happen, unless I get this thing done. So when I'm stressed, I experience the present as a moment. But when I'm not stressed, and especially when I'm meditating, the present expands. It starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't experience the present as a moment. It's more like an open field. One way of looking at this, and I suggest this to you as a meditation experiment, when you're sitting or walking, doing your formal meditation practice, set yourself the job of noticing the point where the present becomes the future. There must be a border where the present becomes the future. See if you can find it. It's an interesting exercise. I've tried, but I couldn't find it. See if you can find the border where the past becomes the present. I couldn't find that either. All I could find was the present. So the present is actually very big and in fact inescapable. What do we mean by the present? I was talking about this to one Zen teacher, and his response was, the present is when things happen. Which is a good answer. Except, I think you don't even need the when. The present is things happening. When we really get down to it, future does not exist. It's just an idea, a concept. Past does not exist. It's just an idea, a concept. Even the present does not exist. It's just an idea. What we have are things happening, and the field within which things happen is vast. It's enormous. So this is how we experience the present. We experience it as an open field rather than as a moment. And it's in this sense, the experience of the present, that it makes sense to talk about a remembered present. If the present is just a moment, there's no time for memory. But if the present has depth, if it's big, then it begins to make sense to talk about the remembered present. And this is what we're dealing with when we work with mindfulness. We're working with the remembered present. So let's keep looking at this relationship between awareness and mindfulness. We are already aware, but we are not necessarily mindful. So, for example, take that meditation experiment where you hold your hands together. Can I feel my hands? Am I aware of my hands? Answer, yes. If we had more time, we could do the same experiment, but this time we could do it for, say, 10 minutes, or 15 minutes, or 20 minutes, or 30 minutes. And then at the end of the 30 minutes, we could ask, were you aware of your hand throughout the last 30 minutes? If I ask you, are you aware of your hands now? The answer is yes. If I ask you, were you aware of your hands for the past 30 minutes? For most people, the answer would be no. Why is the answer different? Simply because of the time span. This is where we come to mindfulness as memory. This morning we were talking about distraction. And I think we established that everybody has experienced distraction. So some people will say, I can't meditate for more than 5 minutes before I get distracted, or 5 seconds, or whatever. So that means that everybody in this room has experienced distraction a great deal. That means that everybody in this room is an expert in distraction. You may not be expert in meditation, but you are expert in distraction. So that means you could describe to me how distraction works. I'm following a meditation object, and then suddenly awareness moves. It goes somewhere else, and I'm distracted. Then there's a gap, and then at some point over here, I suddenly realise, oh, I'm distracted. Have you noticed that when that happens, you don't notice that it happens? That when we're distracted, at first, we don't know that we are distracted. Has anybody noticed that? And then later on, suddenly, we notice that we are distracted. And when you think about it, this is very strange. This is very odd. For those of you who drive, you might have had the very common experience of driving down a familiar road and then suddenly realising that you have no memory of the past 3 blocks that you drove down. Complete blank. Has that ever happened, that sort of thing? Has that ever happened? Now, during those 3 blocks, when you were driving, were you aware? Well, if I ask myself that question, I have to say yes. I must have been aware, because otherwise I'd be dead, or seriously injured. Or other people would be dead, or seriously injured. So I must have been aware. If I ask the question, during those 3 blocks, was I mindful? The answer is No. I can be aware, but not mindful. So what's the difference? The answer is found in the nature of distraction. The moment that I'm distracted, what happens? Suddenly, I forget. I forget that I'm meditating, or I forget my meditation object. Distraction is not the fact that awareness moves. It's not the movement of awareness that is distraction. Awareness always moves. Well, not always, but it's normal for awareness to move. Distraction occurs when awareness moves and I don't see it move. That's the distraction. And the reason why I don't see it move is because suddenly I forget. I forget to meditate. I forget that I am meditating. So I am distracted. I'm caught up, for example, in thinking, and I don't know that I'm thinking. Then after some time, it may be 5 seconds, it may be 50 seconds, it may be 5 minutes, 5 hours, but after some time, suddenly I know that I'm distracted. At first, I don't know that I'm distracted, and in the next moment, I do know. So something changed, something happened. What is the something that happened? What happened then? Suddenly, I remember, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating. The mindfulness is the remembering. If I realise, oh, I'm distracted. Let's say someone is speaking to the meditation teacher. And they say, oh, I completely forgot and I was distracted. And the teacher might say, well, what was the distraction? And he would say, well, I was lost in thinking. And the teacher might say, what was it that you were thinking about? And you might say, oh, I was just daydreaming. Nothing in particular. Just going from one thing to the next. Or I was thinking about what happened before I came to the retreat. Or I was thinking about what we're going to have for lunch. If I can answer the question, what were you thinking about? Then I must have been aware. Because otherwise, I could not answer the question. I was aware, but not mindful. Because I had forgotten. Suddenly, I know that I'm distracted. At that moment, I remember, and that remembering is mindfulness. Do you see the difference between awareness and mindfulness? Awareness is the presence of something. Right now, my meditation object is present. Right now, my distraction is present. Right now, my meditation object has come back. Mindfulness is remembering. The opposite of mindfulness, the loss of mindfulness, is forgetfulness. And when the Buddha talks about how we lose mindfulness, the expression that he uses is forgotten mindfulness, mutta sati, from the verb musati, to forget, to become bewildered, to become confused, to fall into oblivion. Musati also implies delusion. But its essence is forgetting. The loss of mindfulness is forgetting. The activity of mindfulness is remembering. If that's the case, how would we practice mindfulness? What is the practice of mindfulness? The practice of mindfulness is the practice of reminding ourselves. Reminding ourselves that I am already aware, reminding ourselves to be aware of this. Let's say I'm working with a particular meditation object. Let's say it's the breathing. Mindfulness is remembering to be aware of the breathing. And then when I'm distracted, it's because I've forgotten the breathing. So sometimes the mindfulness is directed towards a specific object, and when we're doing a formal meditation practice, that's often the aspect of mindfulness that we're working with. I have to remember I'm breathing. I have to remember I'm breathing in. Now remember I'm breathing out. Don't forget I'm breathing in. Remember, breathing out. Oh, that's right, I'm breathing in. I remember I'm breathing out. So this is the practice. We're reminding ourselves to be aware of this, the meditation object. Or mindfulness can be more general. It simply can be reminding myself that I am already aware. Because I am already aware. I'm not necessarily aware of my meditation object, but I am aware. The practice of mindfulness would be remembering, oh, I'm seeing. Oh, I remember, I'm thinking. Ah, I remember, I'm hearing. Ah, I remember, I'm feeling the pain in my leg. Oh yes, I remember that pain. There's two aspects of mindfulness which we'll go into more detail as we go through the retreat. The first one is quite specific, remembering to be aware of this. So this is directing awareness towards a specific meditation object. I want to remember this. It's like studying for an exam. If I walk into my exam in economics, if I sit down for my economics exam and I have a vivid memory of all the incidents that occurred in my favourite TV soap opera, this is not going to help me with the exam. I need to remember specifically all that stuff about economics that I studied, and so that I can answer the questions. So there, memory acts to remember something quite specific. This is what I want to remember. And it's like working with a meditation object. I want to learn to remember the breathing, or whatever else my meditation object is. That form of mindfulness is particularly relevant when we're doing the sitting and the walking, or a formal standing meditation, or a formal lying down meditation. When we're talking about a specific meditation exercise, we're talking about remembering this in particular. But in the daily activity, the remembering becomes I'm not remembering to be aware of this, I'm remembering I am already aware. I am already walking. I am already thinking. I am already seeing. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing the other. It's much more open. There's no particular object. It doesn't have to be awareness of X. It can be anything. Of course, what I find, if I start to practice mindfulness, I discover how often I forget. Something as basic and as obvious as walking from the hall to the door. It's amazing how easy it is to forget that I'm walking to the door. It's not particularly difficult or esoteric, and yet I forget. And I noticed that I've forgotten when I realised I'm completely caught up in my thinking. And I have no memory of the past 3 steps or a dozen steps because I was caught up in thought. You notice how when the little accidents occur, I drop something, I bump into something, I stumble over something. How often, if I remember back, I realise I had completely forgotten that I was walking to the door. That's when I stumbled. That's when I bumped into something. It was when I forgot what I was doing. Mindfulness in the daily activity is found in simply remembering I am already aware. And it doesn't matter what I am doing. It doesn't matter how fast I am going. It doesn't matter where I am. What matters is the remembering. So we have 2 aspects of mindfulness. Remembering to be aware of this, of my meditation object. It's very aimed, it's very specific. And the mindfulness which is remembering I am already aware, and that's wide open. But both of them, what they have in common is the remembering, and the work is the reminding myself again and again and again. So this takes us into the whole area of our relationship to distraction. People often think that they cannot meditate because they are distracted. I can't do meditation because I sit down, I try to meditate, and within 10 seconds I'm distracted. And if we look at this carefully, what we find is, I'm meditating, suddenly there's a movement into distraction. Awareness moves, but I don't notice that it's moved. And then at some time later, I suddenly remember, I'm thinking, when I should be following the breathing. So that remembering is already mindfulness. This is very important. I don't need to do anything extra to be mindful. I am already mindful because that remembering is mindfulness. What I have is I have a period of mindfulness, then I have a period of forgetting, and then I have a very clear, sharp moment of mindfulness. Then, what do I do? Often, I'll start to punish myself. Pathetic. Can't keep my mind on the meditation object. Useless. Hopeless. So frustrating. It's terrible. Can't do this. It's too hard. Other people can do it, but I can't do it. Complain, judge, etc., etc. And finally, when I get bored with this, I think, I better get back to my meditation. I have a period of mindfulness, then I have a gap, and there's nothing I can do about that gap because it began with forgetting. Suddenly, I have a clear, crystal clear moment of mindfulness, and then I have a big gap in which I lose myself in judgment and discouragement. This second gap is all my own work. And it's because of the judgment that I've put on this moment of mindfulness, which when you think about it is really, really weird. I'm practicing mindfulness. I experience a moment of mindfulness that is so clear and so obvious that it pulls me out of my distraction. And then I complain about it. That's ridiculous. Instead of complaining, that I can't do the meditation. I should be congratulating myself on this brilliant work of mindfulness. I just remembered. It came from nowhere. I was completely lost in my daydream, and then suddenly mindfulness just arose, as if it came from the Buddha himself, spontaneously. I should be congratulating myself. I should be dancing for joy instead of beating myself up. Start to look at your distraction. Start to get interested in it. Start to be interested in, how is it that I forget so easily? Start to be interested in that moment when mindfulness arises. Bingo, got it. And be grateful for the arising of that mindfulness. I'm distracted. That's what's happening. This is mindfulness. This is exactly what I'm meant to be doing. This is great. It's already complete in that moment. And then from there, you just continue. I'm distracted. And we've been talking about it in terms of, okay, so what is this distraction? Keep the mindfulness rolling along. It feels like this. It feels interesting. Or it feels boring. It feels good. It feels bad. I like it. I don't like it. So you start to get a feel for that distraction itself. Now the distraction has already ended, because already I'm mindful. But there's something there. It's like the aftertaste of the distraction. So what is all that about? And then I come back to the primary object. So there's a continuity of mindfulness. It arises, boom, and then I keep it going. Instead of it arises and I immediately do my best to kill it off in order to start it up again sometime in the future. So it's a different relationship to distraction. Do not treat distraction as the enemy. Treat distraction as the teacher. It's teaching me about the nature of mindfulness. And it's an important lesson. If I start to pay attention to that moment when mindfulness arises, then that gap that we talked about, I'm mindful, I forget, there's a gap, and suddenly I remember, that gap starts to shrink from this end, starts to get smaller. The really interesting one is this one, the first one, the forgetting. Can I catch the forgetting? Can I see myself forget? That's much more difficult, but very interesting. What happens if I see the awareness move to something else? What is that? It's mindfulness. It is not distraction. It's what the Buddha would call the perception of impermanence. It's seeing awareness as it moves. If I'm mindful of distraction, I'm not distracted. It's very interesting the way it works. The Buddha associates mindfulness with wisdom. Satipatthana, the establishing of mindfulness, or the foundations of mindfulness, is regarded as a wisdom practice. So we have insight meditation. It's a wisdom practice. Why is mindfulness associated with wisdom? If we look at it, the moment that I forget and I slide into distraction, that forgetting is the opposite of wisdom. It's delusion. In that moment, I have no idea what's going on. A state of forgetting is a state of delusion. Have you ever had the experience of doing something like, let's say you're packing up to come to a meditation retreat, and you know that you have to pack A, B, C and D, and you know that very well. So you do all your packing, You come to the retreat centre, you unpack, there's no D. I forgot D. I remembered A, I remembered B, I remembered C, but I forgot D. How did that happen? Now, in the moment that you forgot D, did you know that you forgot D? No. If you knew, you would not have forgotten. In the moment that you forgot D, did you think you had a problem? No. You thought everything was fine. You only realise you have a problem when you get to the centre and you're unpacking and you realise, oh, I forgot it. When you forget, there are two things that are happening. One is you've got a problem, and the other is you don't know that you've got a problem. That is the very essence of delusion. When we have a problem and we don't know. Someone sent me a very nice card some years ago. Had a photograph of an old photograph of a young man at the front, and I won't try to describe the picture, but the caption was brilliant. It said, "All you need in life is ignorance and self-confidence." And you can see a lot of people are like that. It's one of the reasons why the world is in such a bad state. When we're ignorant, when we're deluded, we don't know that we're deluded. So we have complete confidence. We think we're doing the right thing, but actually we're making a complete mess. This is the nature of delusion. The movement from mindfulness into the forgetting of mindfulness is a movement from wisdom into delusion. The remembering, the movement from distraction into mindfulness, is a movement from delusion into wisdom. So mindfulness and wisdom go together. They're very close. Part of this wisdom functions as an ability to monitor the situation. Let's go back to our sense of the present. The present is big. It includes the remembered present. Now what I mean by that is, let's say I'm meditating, I'm distracted, and suddenly I realise I'm distracted. The first thing I notice is where I am now. So this is important. So to be fully present to this experience as I come out of delusion into mindfulness. The next thing I might do is actually to look back. What happened? How did I lose it? And just check. Just have a look. So this is in the past, yet when the present becomes big, it's part of the present as well. What happened just then? So I am monitoring the process. How is it that I forget? How is it that I remember? I think driving, for example, is a very, very good mindfulness practice. A lot of the way that mindfulness works can be revealed through driving meditation. Maybe we should ask Bhante if we can get out the motorcycles and have the meditators drive up and down as part of the practice. But when you go back, those of you who are drivers, you know that when you're driving, you have to be aware. And it's mainly physical, it's the body, in the broader sense of including vision, sound, etc. Vision is very important, because what you do when you drive, you've got the physical adjustments to the controls, and visually you're scanning the landscape all the time, and the landscape is constantly changing. So you have to keep in mind what's happening with the road in terms of straight, corners, hills, up, down. Where are other cars? How fast are they going? Where are they relative to me now? and how are they moving, and so on. So you notice that when you realise that you've just completely been distracted from driving, and you come back into the present, the first thing you do is check the landscape again, because everything is different now. So the cars that have moved, and I've moved. So I re-establish the landscape. When you're driving, you can first of all have the mindfulness exercise of simply staying with the driving all of the time. So probably turn off the radio, try not to talk to the passengers, and just focus on the driving itself. And really, as a discipline, stay with the physical experience of what I'm doing, the calculations I have to make, where everybody is, so that at any moment I know exactly what's happening in this whole landscape. Of course, I then forget, I then remember again, and at that moment when you remember, just take a moment to look back. How did I forget? What happened? And then back to the landscape. And when you look back, what happened? Sometimes you can see, sometimes you can't, but sometimes you can see. Ah yes, I get caught up in that particular thought because it's entertaining. Or, ah yes, I was getting bored and the mind wanted some entertainment. Or, I saw something and it reminded me of something else. And we can recognize it. Oh, that's what happened. That's how I lost mindfulness. So, okay, I won't do that again. I'll be careful about that. And I stay with the process. It's bigger than a moment. It's much wider. And because it's wider, it involves a self-monitoring. I'm watching the whole process. What is it that is happening now? How is it that I forget? When I remember, where am I where I remember? And how do I get myself back on course? It's much bigger than a moment. So this is mindfulness. And we do the same thing in the meditation practice. I suddenly realize, oh, I'm distracted. First of all, I am already mindful. That's important. Secondly, having already established mindfulness, I might then look back, what happened just then? Don't waste time thinking about it. You either recognize it or you don't recognize it. If you don't recognize it, forget it. Let me suggest that there'll be plenty of distractions in the future for you to practice with. So you don't have to suck everything out of this one. But you're starting to get into the habit of monitoring what happens and getting interested in how is it that I'm distracted so easily? What happens? And training yourself, reminding yourself to stay with, oh, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. Remembering, reminding ourselves. The practice of mindfulness is a practice of reminding ourselves, I am already aware. And this is a wide open general mindfulness, which is, I think, best experienced in ordinary everyday activity. So make it a point when you're here of the very simple practice of whatever you're doing, keep reminding yourself, oh, this is what I'm doing. Oh, I'm washing my clothes. I remember, I'm washing my clothes. Oh, that's right, I'm washing. Ah, yeah, I'm washing. And then, oh, no, I'm thinking. Oh, that's right, I'm thinking. Oh, I'm seeing. I'm hearing. And you notice it doesn't matter what it is. It's the reminding yourself, oh, that's what I'm doing. Oh, I remember, I'm doing this. Oh, it's this now. Oh, it's this. It's wide open. It can be anything at all. When you do the formal meditation practice, you give yourself something specific to remember. For the next 45 minutes, I'm going to remember my breathing. or I'm going to remember the action of walking. And see what happens. Of course, you won't remember for the whole 45 minutes. There'll be big periods of time when you forget. There's nothing you can do about it. But each moment that you remember, when you realize that you're distracted, treat that moment as gold. That's very, very valuable. Don't waste it with self-judgment. Or, if you're going to have judgment, judge yourself as being mindful. Congratulate yourself. Ah, I just remembered. Isn't that good? And get a feel for what it's like to remember. Because what you're looking at is the movement from delusion into wisdom. What is that like? What happens? And you also might look back, so what happened just then? That movement from wisdom into delusion, from mindfulness into forgetting. What happened back then? Don't spend time thinking about it, but just have a look. If you can't find it, don't worry about it. There will be other occasions. But you're studying the process of distraction, of how you go in and how you come out, which means you're studying the process of mindfulness. And it's very, very useful.